Welcome back. I'm happy to introduce to you our chair for the next session, Eric Fahlbach, who is the chairman of the OECD Committee on Industry, Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Please, thanks.
Thank you so much, and most welcome to this session. We will discuss emerging technologies and firm dynamics this morning. I'm from Sweden. 15 years ago, I joined a number of friends and we moved into a so-called eco-village in Sweden. We actually planned and more or less ordered the buildings that we live in. And this eco-village is supposed to be more environmentally friendly, etc., etc. And within that frame, we are 22 families, and we had our own sewage plant. We took care of our own wastewater, etc., etc. So we tried to make small efforts in improving the environment in the most closed area for us. This small-scale water plant, sewage plant, actually met higher regulations, stricter regulations than the big one in the municipality. So we had to work very hard to meet these requirements because it was a new plant, and the new plant had stricter restrictions than the old one. It took a lot of efforts, it took a lot of man-hours, and the result is by now that we are, as the rest of the municipality, on the common one and not on our own one. We didn't really have the energy or the economy to run this small-scale innovation. And this, I think, is parallel to much of what we see in the struggle in a broader sense. What we work with in CIIE is, among other things, firm dynamics, and it is emerging technologies to some extent. We look now based on microdata, we try to investigate much better the conditions for productive firms and firm dynamics. What characterizes the more productive firms? What institutional settings and policy options result in more favorable outcomes? And under what conditions do we see more positive firm dynamics, more rapid growth by entrants, etc., etc.? We have also studied patents in a number of studies, and we have one effort trying to build on the outcomes that we know today, trace back if there were some signs that could be used to find patterns for what afterwards turned out to be more radical innovations. So these questions on incremental or radical innovations, on conditions for more dynamic development, will be part of what we will discuss this morning. And what are the policy risks? What are the market risks? Can we harmonize policy risks to market risks, etc., etc.? We have a number of eminent presenters. First of all, we will have a speech from Gregory Nemeth from University of Wisconsin-Madison. He will speak more broadly and generally. And then we will have Marjolein Helder, who will present her own work and life achievements, more or less. Very exciting, I would say. A small-scale firm trying to bring news to the market. And then from a more established one, we will have Dermot Comby. He will be here. He has been very kind to fill in for Volker Motti. He's the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at Ingersoll Rand, and that's a larger scale company. And we will have much insights from them. And finally, from Florian Egil, we will have, he is now at Mercator Fellow on International Affairs, some, again, more general observations. So please, lady and gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Eric. So I focus on the interaction between policy and innovation with a particular focus on how government actions can stimulate innovation in low-carbon energy technologies. And I like to say that my work kind of goes in two directions. Part of it is empirical, historical, looking at case studies, looking at previous data. And part of it is policy analysis, is forward-looking, is modeling, is considering alternatives among policy actions. And today, I'd like to talk briefly about 4 items. One is a framework for thinking about how policy can affect the innovation process. Then I'd like to talk about 2 challenges to interacting with that process. And then finally conclude with a list of items for future research that some colleagues and I have recently put together. So just to begin, sorry, Eric, how do I advance? Is it this?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So just a couple of things to have in mind are kind of several properties of innovation that I won't go into now, but just to make the case that there are certain properties of innovation that generate surprise or serendipity involved. There's a lack of predictability, and these have to do with the items on the left-hand column then. And then there's other drivers of kind of smoothness and gradualness in the innovation system. And I think we're often trying to make a comparison between radical and incremental innovation. And really what we're thinking about in terms of the outcome of a system is a system that includes emergent characteristics, including several of the items on the left, and a system that has inertia and smoothness and slowness to it, which is on the right, especially for energy technologies. So those are just items to keep in mind as going forward. So I'd like to just introduce this simple model of how policy can affect the innovation process. And I'd like to think of it as kind of a meso model, like in between the richness and the full explanation that we had yesterday when we were thinking about innovation systems, in between that rich description and a much more parsimonious, narrow description that has to do with maybe an economic viewpoint, which is much more about identifying market failures precisely and then using price signals to address those market failures. So this is something in between the simple and the complex. And so it starts with this kind of old, almost ancient idea of the innovation process of going from the discovery of new knowledge, invention, the commercialization of that new knowledge and innovation, and then the adoption and diffusion of innovations, which in the end is really what matters. What makes this model more interesting than the model from 50 years ago is it includes this feedbacks in the process. So you can see these arrows going backwards. From market experience can inform new ways to adopt technologies and even identify new ways to look for new innovations and new patents and things like that. So we've got this core innovation process, and sometimes you can map that to stages of the innovation process. This kind of works pretty well with governments thinking about basic research versus other parts of the innovation process. And then the next thing I'd like to do in terms of adding on to this is to think about interacting at 2 ends of the process. And so you can think about doing technology push, which is on the left side there, and demand pull on the right side there. And so let me just define those in a couple of minutes here. So we can think about technology push as Bill Gates is a big fan of technology push. So that mission innovation from 2 weeks ago is 100% technology push. So was the Manhattan Project. So was the Apollo project to land someone on the moon. Basically about science, marshaling science and engineering, big investment in R&D, trying to come up with new discoveries and new technologies. And the goal there, in terms of the government goal, is to increase the availability of knowledge. And there's no doubt that lots of knowledge was created by the Apollo project, by the Manhattan Project, and certainly would be by mission innovation for energy and climate. On the other side is demand pull, and this is working on the other end of the process. This is working on increasing the size of the market for new technology. So if you think about, well, I'll talk about some examples in a minute, but things like a feed-in tariff or subsidies for new technologies, that's all increasing the market for a new technology. So technology push is working on R&D, the science, the availability of new knowledge, and with demand pull, we're trying to increase the markets for those new technologies. In terms of the actors and incentives, this is what it means for private actors. So if you do technology push, if Bill Gates is successful in getting all these private investors to invest their billions of dollars, and importantly get governments also to invest maybe double their R&D or maybe more, what that does for private actors is it reduces the cost of innovation. They get access to new technologies, they get access to new knowledge, they get access to newly trained scientists and engineers that are smart about new materials or new ways of incorporating information into energy and whatever things are invested in that area. So in terms of incentives, you get lower cost of innovation. On the other side, with demand pull, what it means for private actors is the payoffs to innovation are increased. And so it's not just about deploying technologies and trying to get some of the benefits of these cleaner technologies. It's about creating incentives so that private actors will invest in research, improve technologies, maybe get to scale, and with that, improve the performance of those technologies and maybe the cost of them over time as well. So be more specific about what this means on the left-hand side with technology push. The big one is research and development, but also tax credits for private sector to do research. Education is certainly a big part of technology push, was a big part of what came out of the Apollo project in the 1960s. Demonstration projects, I'll talk about that in a little bit, kind of a troubling one. And then knowledge networks, so finding ways to get people together to share knowledge, that's been really important. And actually the OECD probably plays a big role in that type of activity. And then on the other side, the big one for demand pull generally is intellectual property regulation. So giving investors a temporary monopoly, a 20-year monopoly on their patents so that they can charge higher prices for 20 years. That certainly retards the diffusion of innovation, but it creates strong incentives for invention. So there's a trade-off there. You could price externalities, so carbon pricing would do that. Subsidizing demand, that's been actually much more popular than pricing carbon. Government procurement, I think we heard about that yesterday. And then technology standards is another way to increase the market for a new technology. So that's what we have, technology push and demand pull. What is tricky there is to say a lot of the arguments there are which one should we do? Should we do Bill Gates and just invest and beef up our research and development? Or should we say we have the technologies we need and we really need to deploy them now because we're running out of time? The consensus seems to be from the kind of historical looking at what has worked in the past is that you need both. But that raises this important policy question is how to allocate, how to get the right mix of research, technology push, and then demand pull. So that's kind of a key policy challenge is that allocation. What I'd like to do now is talk about two other policy challenges that come out of thinking about innovation and government in this way. And so the first one is thinking about what we do when demand pull is fragile, when the incentives that come from demand pull policies are not fully credible. And then second, what happens with innovations or technologies that are in this intermediate stage, that are between technology push, the R&D stage, and the market stage, the commercialized, available technologies, the demand pull stage. And that includes a particular problem that I'll talk about in just a minute. So first, fragile demand pull. So here's the problem. If we're thinking about environmental technologies, energy technologies, climate change, there's this inherently long-term aspect to it. So CO2 that goes up in the atmosphere might stay up there for decades, if not a century. Capital stock that we build in the energy sector similarly will last for decades, maybe on the order of 50 years, 60 years. So what happens in terms of the payoffs to new inventions, to new innovations, is they depend on the future. They depend on expectations. And because so much of the attributes of these technologies are public goods, they depend not just on market expectations, but on policy expectations. And so those are crucial. And so the question then is what happens to actors, to investors, what happens to investment if expectations about future policy, that's not next year, but maybe in 5, 10 years, 20 years, what happens if those expectations include uncertainty? And it's particularly important if that uncertainty is not symmetric, but has some skew to it, which I think there's probably evidence to support that it actually is a skewed distribution in investors' heads. So do we need additional incentives? Let me just illustrate this with a little bit more detail. So first is the evidence that commitments we have so far are not fully credible. So this is a kind of a caricature of U.S. oil imports and 3 targets. And the first one you see in 1973 was made by President Nixon in Project Independence to have the U.S. oil import independent by the end of the decade, by 1980. The thick black line is the historical record. And you can kind of see how we didn't even come close to meeting that target. Jimmy Carter made a similar target. We didn't meet that one either. And President Obama has made one as well, much less ambitious and a little closer to actually meeting it. But this just illustrates this evidence, and this is in a US context. So one thing we did is looked at all the energy-related targets we could find that included a target of more than 5 years in the last 40 years. And we came up with 65 targets, and then we evaluated whether the targets were met or not. And depending on how you count, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the targets were met, and roughly 1/3 were not met. So there's reasons for investors to be suspicious about targets, even though I think they're probably more skeptical than they actually should be given the historical performance. So that's just to say that there's evidence that governments don't always meet the targets that they set. And in terms of what this implies for investors, for incentives, for actors, this is just a little anecdote. So I was interviewing venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, thinking of these people as kind of the most sophisticated investors in terms of assessing risk, of compiling portfolios of different investments, willing to tolerate lots of losers in order to find one, they call them unicorns now, but $1 billion payoff. And I thought they would have an interesting way of addressing policy risk. So I asked them how they include that in their models of potential investments. And I got this answer when I said, how do you value these benefits? And it's pretty clear. We said, we ignore it. What the government giveth, it can taketh away. So it really builds on this experience of the past of these targets not being credible, and really what they see, these investments that they're making, and some of them are in clean technology, but they're trying to pay off based on consumers valuing new information or valuing convenience or valuing green attributes, but they're not doing it because of policy. I think they're actually leaving something on the table here, but you can see that the most sophisticated investors in technology seem to be especially risk-averse when it comes to policy. And I saw this also, here's another anecdote from a European perspective of saying basically the same thing. So let me just talk for 1 minute here about why this actually matters, why these incentives matter, and why credibility matters. So here's one example of looking at, I think we had 2 or 3 mentions yesterday of solar photovoltaics getting cheaper. And so I've done some work on that, and the question is, why did solar get cheap? The full answer is it's a big combination of factors, but if you had to pick one, it has to do with expectations. And so let me just tell that story for a couple minutes. So here's the 80-year history and future of solar power, and this vertical axis here is in dollars per megawatt hour, and that's roughly today what a US household consumes in electricity a month. So you can think about this as the cost of electricity from solar for a residential consumer per month for a US household. So back in the 50s, it was pretty hard to afford $100,000 per month in electricity, but one consumer could do that, and that was the US space program. So we had satellites that did that, and then over time, the cost of solar came down. This is a logarithmic scale. So those are big reductions from the 1957 satellite launch to 2007, where this one ends. If we zoom in on that last period, we're starting to see solar that's cheap enough that it could replace a roofing material. So let's zoom in on that. So no more logarithmic scale. So we're going down from $1,000 per megawatt hour, $1,000 a month, down to about $400. And then put a couple of other data points up here. So that dashed line is US retail electricity prices. So in a way, that's the target. Secretary Chu had this target in 2011 that by the end of the decade, we'd get down to about 6 cents per kilowatt hour, or $60 per megawatt hour. That's that diamond there. And then a few years ago, I was involved with a group doing expert elicitation. So trying to get expectations about future technologies out of experts' heads. So trying to get probability distributions out of their heads. And so we tried to do that, and we did that with about 200 experts. And you can see this is their estimates of the cost of solar power in 2030 from roughly 2010, 2011. That's their best guess, so mid-range estimate. Here are the best cases, and there are the worst cases there. And then let's put on the actual data for recently. So this is utility scale power in the US, so actually below the Secretary Chu target by 2012 there. And then if you put on the residential prices, those are higher. but also going down, and also some of them below U.S. retail rates without subsidies there. So I guess there's a few points that you could make on this graph. I mean, one of the most interesting to me is this wide dispersion in prices, and that there's not one price of any of these technologies, that markets matter and lots of other things matter. But what I'd like to come back to is this issue of how this all happened and why the experts were wrong. And so partly the big reason is, how did this all happen, is economies of scale, that investors, people developing the technology were confident that there were markets for PV. They were willing to invest $500 million in a factory of that size there on the left there, and also willing to invest in automation. So instead of having a batch process, there are robots doing a lot of this work, and new machines got developed for them. All of that happened because there were expectations that there would be a market for this, and that these billions of dollars in investment in infrastructure and manufacturing would eventually pay off because there would be a market. And so this comes back to this issue of policy credibility. For some reason, and that story I think needs to be told, is what that reason is, there were expectations that there would be a market for PV. And it was not just the German feed-in tariff, but that was a big part of it. But similarly, markets in Japan, in China, in Italy, and in California as well. So the point here is that expectations matter, and policy credibility is important. So some recent work I've been working on is trying to think of ways that you could address this, this issue of policy credibility. And I'm happy to talk more about that later. But I want to talk about one other challenge here, which is this issue of being at the stage between technology push and demand pull. And there's quite a few technologies that fit in this category. So if we're at this demonstration stage in the middle there, we've got this problem where the social returns are still high, but the private returns are low. Partly that has to do with probably 4 reasons, that there's spillovers, that any company can observe a demonstration program and figure out if it works or not just by watching. So why do they need to invest? Why not just wait and see? If everyone thinks that way, then you don't get investment. Typically, for some of these projects, you can't do it incrementally. You can't just build a small scale and then build the next one. You have to build $100, $500 million or euro projects. There's still high risk because it might not actually work. Building it at scale might reveal new problems that weren't apparent in the laboratory or at pilot stage. And coming back to this policy credibility issue, you're doing all this when the payoffs depend on policies and the policies are uncertain. And so that's led to this idea of the valley of death, where new promising technologies go to die because no one's willing to invest, the capital requirements are too large, it's still risky, and no one really knows what the market's going to be. So another metaphor that comes out of the valley of death is this one. I'll just illustrate it with this big demonstration effort in the 1970s to get the U.S. off of oil imports, which is the U.S. Synfuels Corporation under Jimmy Carter. About $5 billion spent with the goal of replacing about 1/3 of U.S. oil imports by 1992. And almost no usable fuel was produced from this $5 billion of investment. And part of the reason is get into some of those reasons. Probably the biggest reason is the crash in oil prices that happened just a few years as these plants were coming online. There's a similar story with a big effort a few years ago to address the rising cost of silicon as an input into solar PV. And so about $500 million in government loans were put in place for this company called Solindra. And for similar reasons, which I just showed you a couple of slides ago with the fall in the price of PV, this technology was no longer competitive. And so it's led to this idea of the technology pork barrel. And so we've got this valley of death where you have to somehow support technologies in the middle with large investments. But you've also got this historical record there where people think about these investments as just pork. And that's just a U.S. Metaphor for politicians doing favors for each other and distributing government revenues to their districts. And so that really flies in the face of maybe trying to focus and concentrate resources on a few projects and leads to this dispersion of resources. And in both of these cases had mismanagement and corruption involved as well. And so we've got this difficult discourse between valid reasons for being skeptical about these investments and other reasons that might just have to do with bad luck and that maybe these were just insurance policies against high oil prices or high silicon prices for solar. And so here's the systemic interpretation of the technology pork barrel, is that American political institutions introduce predictable, systematic biases to R&D programs so that on balance, government projects will be susceptible to performance underruns and cost overruns. And they didn't say this, but lots of other people have said this since, is that this shows that governments should not pick winners. And it really raises this issue of what to do if you face the valley of death, if you've got these issues of scale, of large spillovers, and uncertainty about the future, which altogether force a choice, force us to think about how we might achieve scale in our innovation portfolios. And so this idea is that government should stay out and not pick winners. If you really believe that, that puts a lot of technologies off the table. And so one thing we're trying to do in some current work right now is to think about joining these metaphors together and bridging the valley of death while avoiding the technology pork barrel. So looking at what factors does the case for government intervention rest? I've mentioned some of those, and how to maximize the effectiveness of government support. And just to close, I'm just working on a paper with some colleagues, and I thought it would be relevant for this audience, is we're writing a paper on missing perspectives on energy innovation, especially focused on social science perspectives that are not included right now. So some of them are incentives and bureaucracies. What happens if government R&D allocation is done based on risk aversion and with principal agent problems and may not reflect the societal benefits that might be at stake? How do we maximize knowledge dissemination? So we talked about the intellectual property system being a strong way of creating new markets, but that also retards the dissemination of new technology, new knowledge. So how to advance that, how to work on international collaboration on technology and international cooperation. The credibility of policy targets, I've mentioned. Public attitudes to novel technologies. So that's something that's not been in a lot of models, but partly explains why some technologies get adopted and why some technologies do not get adopted. Incorporating some of those ideas earlier in the innovation process could make these government investments more effective. Characterizing the social returns to innovation, that's a really difficult thing to do, but a lot of these technologies have strong co-benefits, have a broad set of benefits, and it's actually very rare to even look at studies of the returns with actual empirical measures of returns, but the ones that do probably need to take a broader look. And then finally is to think about why we're doing all this, and why we're doing this is to somehow improve human well-being, somehow to address some of the problems with especially our energy system. And so social science can help in clarifying that. But what we really need, I think, is to identify some metrics to see how well we're doing, to see if we're on the right path. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gregory. We will come back to questions, especially from the audience later on. So please sharpen your pens and write down interesting questions. But I can't help asking at least one final question to you. 7 promising ones, or only some of them promising? Could you make a comment on the list of all these topics?
I think the one that seems crucial to me right now, but that'll actually take some work, is to understand how do actors form expectations about the markets in the future? How do they interpret policy uncertainty? I talked about venture capitalists, but it's not just them. It's financiers. It's also individuals. How do they change their behavior? How do they make their decisions, especially the long-term ones? How do they consider the long-term future? And I've looked for it and have not found very much empirical work on that. So understanding policy credibility really from the eyes of the incentives and the actors that might actually do something about it, I think is a research program that would take some work and probably requires empirics, interviews, maybe even kind of grounded methods of really understanding how these actors work. But I think that's one where we could really improve some of our outcomes by understanding that better.
Thanks a lot. Why don't we ask the next presenter exactly those questions? I guess you will speak of some other things as well, but Marilyn, please take the floor.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here. Indeed, I will talk to you about my experience with getting a disruptive innovation to the market. And Well, based on the model that Gregory just showed, I think we're just getting out of the valley of death right now. I'm just hoping that we just got out of the valley and that we're going up now. We'll have to see whether we're going to have a fallback before we do. So let me tell you shortly about my experience in getting this technology, this innovation to the market. So how do you get from science to the invention and to the innovation and eventually get the innovation to the market? I started as a PhD at Wageningen University in the Netherlands to do research on a technology to produce electricity from living plants. Now, the first question you ask yourself, so why would we do that? Well, as you probably know, still the larger part of our electricity production comes from fossil fuels, coal-fired power plants in most cases. We do have some alternatives, and we're increasingly using these alternative energy sources. So we only know solar power and wind power and hydropower. The problem is that we do use biomass for energy production and for electricity production as well, but it's not very efficient. Because what we do when we use biomass as an energy source, we grow a crop, we harvest it, we transport it, we probably make biogas out of it and then make electricity out of the biogas. So we got a lot of conversion steps in between that actually limits the efficiency of the energy production from the biomass. And the second challenge with using biomass is that we all know these discussions about land use and competing claims on the same land. So we at Wageningen University, we had the idea that we needed to do something about it, because still we think that there's a lot of energy stored, so biochemical energy stored in biomass, and we should be able to use that efficiently. And then we came up with this process. And I'll shortly run you through it to give you a bit of understanding. So basically, a plant produces organic matter via photosynthesis. So it uses solar power and converts the solar power into chemical energy, basically, glucose. So the plant uses part of the organic matter for its own growth, and what's left over is excreted into the soil. In the soil, bacteria break down the organic matter, and in that process, electrons are released. So we found a way to actually capture the electrons that were excreted by the bacteria, capture them in a carbon electrode, and then if you couple that electrode to a second electrode, basically you've got a battery. And the nice thing here is that it's completely running on biological processes. So our electrodes are both carbon electrodes, so they're not included in the process. They won't degrade, they won't dissolve. This is inert material. So basically we're purely running on this biological process, on the bacteria releasing the electrons. Well, this was a nice idea when we started. And actually by now we've been able to get this on the market, put our first products on the market, and scale up to our biggest system is now 100 square meters. And we can use it to power lights along the roadside, for example. So we're starting to put this technology into practice. But while we were doing that, we obviously ran into some problems, and we had quite a few challenges to overcome. And what probably holds for most startup companies coming out of university or just starting up with a great idea wherever they come from, you always have the challenge to get stuff financed. At least in the beginning, you don't have any credit, any profit, so you have to find your finances somewhere else. There's this big challenge of credibility, and Gregory shortly discussed that as well. We've got this new technology, and someone has to adopt it, has to believe that it's actually going to work. Probably the first thing you thought when I said we can make electricity with living plants. You were thinking, yeah, right. Show me before I believe that. Oh, and by the way, when you've seen it, you still don't believe it. What happens a lot is when I do bring a demo, that people look at it and say, okay, where's the battery? I say, there's no battery. This is the battery. Yeah, right. So credibility is a big thing here. It is difficult to gain that credibility. And then there's this challenge of managing expectations. So when someone starts to believe that it could actually work, then people start thinking, and they have these ideas. Oh, and I could charge my cell phone on a plant. Can you give me a plant? Can I charge my cell phone? And I say, well, maybe in a few years' time, 5 to 10 years. And then the next day there's in the newspaper that it's actually possible to charge your cell phone with a plant. Well, there you go. And the final one, and I'm really happy that Gregory already discussed this as well, is knowledge dissemination. So when you start with a very innovative, disruptive technology, there are only a few people actually working on the technology. And at least in our case, our biggest challenge is to get this knowledge dispersed over so many people that we can actually scale up. Now, when you look at the timeline, more or less, so how does this develop? Everyone thinks, okay, so we've got this great idea, and then science comes in, and we do the experiments, and then we write a business plan, and we've got all these coaches helping us with the business plan and helping us with the business and telling us how it works with the valley of death. And then we start making money, and in the end, there's the profit. We're wrong. At least in our case, and I can tell you in 99% of the other cases as well. Because actually, this is how it looks like. Profit is not always where you expect it, and basically, it's a big mess. So you think you're going forward, and it turns out that actually what you were doing wasn't the right thing to do, so you go backwards again. You turn around, you see what other options there are. Oh, and there are these coaches who think they know what's happening because they've been doing this for years, but they've never worked with this technology, right? Because it's new. And it turns out they were wrong. So this is actually what happens. And we're all trying to build models and to make policies to help all these disruptive innovations and get them to the market. The problem is there's just not one way to do that. But there are some things that we've found that could actually help. First of all, I think that when we're talking about innovative technologies and innovative products, we need to look at innovative business models. So it doesn't work to say we build a standard business plan, we write a standard business plan, that we've been doing that for years, and we say, okay, we start, what's your market? That's our first question normally. So what's your market? We say, well, basically everywhere where plants can grow and enough water is available, we can use this technology to produce electricity. Yeah, so what's your market? Well, basically every wetland in the world. That's not good enough. And you say, why not? Because it actually gives the scope of what we can do with this technology. So, okay, and then people say, so what's your first market? Where are you going to start? Who is your customer? We say, well, everyone who believes that this technology can change the world. That's not good enough. Put your customer in a group. I say, well, there is not a group. We found out, actually, people told us, you need to focus on a specific customer group. Who is your target customer? And we decided we were not going to do that. And it turns out that actually our current customers are very diverse, come from government, companies, individuals. So there's basically, we cover the whole range, and there's just this one characteristic that they have in common, which is they believe that this technology could change the world. So I strongly believe that we were right and all the coaches were wrong, which is probably why we're still right in the middle of the valley of death. Agreed. So then for the credibility, when it comes to government support for innovative technologies, we're always talking about subsidies. Getting the technology to the market, okay, we subsidize it for a while. We give you R&D subsidies, we give you grants. This is all really nice, but it's not always working. For example, in the Netherlands and in the rest of Europe as well, as a government, you can only subsidize 50% of a project. Okay, so how do I finance the other 50%? I started off with nothing. We don't make any profit. So where do I get the other 50% of my project? There's just no way to do that. Unless the government gives a loan for the other 50%, which they're not allowed to based on rules from the EU, basically. So what would be much more efficient, and we've found that this actually works in quite a few cases, and lucky for us, in an increasing number of cases, the government at several levels, so municipalities, provinces, and the national governments, actually act as a launching customer. And that helps in two ways. Basically, they say, we believe that this could be potentially breakthrough technology. We believe in it and we give it a shot. And you've got profit. So basically, they buy your product, even though it's not finished yet. And this works quite well for us. And actually, we're getting somewhere. Now, when it comes to managing expectations, when we would have known, like the first day when we started, that media is going to tell what you can do in 10 years' time, we would have made our story a bit different. The problem was that as soon as we started up the company and we told university we were doing that, like international media jumped on it and said, wow, this is cool. We can tell our readers, our viewers that this is possible. And we were managing expectations for the next 5 years, telling everyone, okay, what media told you, we can do that probably in 10 years' time. And people are very stubborn. So they call us and they say, but the newspaper said that it's possible. I said, well, I'm the one running the company, I tell you it's not possible. But the media said, the newspaper said, it was on television, so it must be true. Well, there's an interesting thing. You can use that to your advantage at a certain point, but it can be very annoying. So there's this challenge of actually using that to your advantage. And then for the final one, so about the knowledge dissemination, it's very challenging to train your people, especially in a high-tech company, I guess. So we found out that it takes about half a year for people to get used to our technology and start really working with it. So we need to think up front, so what are we going to do the next year and the year after that, and how many people are we going to need for that, because we need to train our people quite early on. And this brings in a lot of cost and a new challenge, obviously, but well, for now we've managed. We're with 5 people. We got our first products to the market, and it turns out that more and more people start believing that we could actually bring this breakthrough technology to the market, and that we might actually turn 15% of the wetlands worldwide into electricity plants to generate all the electricity we need. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marlene. I hope we will come back to a number of questions from the audience later on, not the least public procurement. And this is, of course, one magnificent illustration of much of what Gregory spoke about. Now we will have a totally different story from a totally different scale of operations. So, please, Dermot.
Good morning. My name is Dermot Crombie. I'm with Ingersoll Rand. Ingersoll is an American multinational manufacturing company publicly traded, listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Probably a little different to Marilyn's story. So just a little bit about myself, maybe just to help set the scene. And to go back to Eric's opening comments, I am currently building a passive home, Scandinavian as it happens, but building it in the west of Ireland. No point in making this easy. I am putting in a self-contained sewage system, so I note with interest where you are at this point. But while my background is in engineering, so I would know a little bit about thermodynamics, a little bit about heating and ventilation from our company. What I have had to learn an awful lot about was regulation. But we're getting there. So that's just a little bit of setting the scene. See if we can get this. So a little bit about Ingersoll. 40,000 employees. Eventually, Marilyn, you'll be there. It brings its own challenges. So 40,000 employees, about $14 billion turnover. In a number of areas, we're involved. So, for instance, golf cars you might be aware of. But at one point, we were the biggest manufacturer of electric vehicles in the world. Trivia. We're big into manufacturing and supporting efficiency in manufacturing. Another big area we're involved in is a brand called Thermo King, which is transport refrigeration, and we'll be coming back to that a little bit. And also air conditioning for buildings. And obviously these, both the transport and the building HVAC, we were watching hugely with interest the last couple of weeks in Paris with COP21. So some of the challenges we're having going forward. Urbanization is obviously a big challenge. The population worldwide, along with growing, is also moving to cities. We also have challenges going forward on food and water availability. Then we have more immediate challenges, technical challenges such as refrigerants, and energy efficiency within the existing building stock. If we just take an example such as food, 80 years ago, people ate food, fresh food, that was grown within 100 miles of where they lived in season in the developed world. That's just 80 years ago. Today in the developed world, you can eat anything you like, any day of the year, pretty much in the developed world. So you can have strawberries at Christmas, you can have kiwis that your parents didn't have, and that's all been brought about by transport refrigeration. So it's become ubiquitous in our lives, certainly in the Western world. In the same way, buildings have evolved enormously, and we have climates now. We have comfortable climates, indoor climates, that we didn't have not that long ago. So if we talk about opportunities going forward, 75% of the infrastructure globally that will exist in 2050 has yet to be built. In India, 85% has yet to be built. The infrastructure that will be in place in 2050, 85% has yet to be built. Now, that's an opportunity, and maybe we're starting from scratch, so we can look at it as a positive and get it right, but it'll have to be very right. We'll see a 70 to 85% increase in our urban population in the next 35 years. And within those urban populations, we will require a quality of life. Now, cities, and certainly in Europe, Western Europe, are looking at the quality of life for populations within cities. So, for instance, we have noise standards, we have emission standards, but overall, how they're measuring success, for instance, in London, is longevity. How is life expectancy growing within cities? And it can be down to reduced noise, it can be down to better air quality, more green spaces. There are many, many factors. But obviously getting our environment right is very, very important. But the key measure is longevity. Interestingly enough, in the US, 80% of the houses that will be used in 2050 already exist. So it's the opposite way. So now we have to get clever solutions for the existing building stock. So we have a dual challenge here. And to take another example, today there are around 1.5 million refrigerated containers in the world, and there are around 2 million equivalent truck units in the world carrying food. With the phase out of high global warming refrigerants, we need solutions for that existing stock. If we simply switched off the existing stock of refrigerant tomorrow and you watched the equipment availability decline, then you would have another challenge. So people expect that the food supply will remain in place. That's obviously very important. But we need to have solutions for the existing equipment, plus develop, both on the housing side and on the transport refrigeration side. We need to develop solutions to support the existing equipment installed base and to develop new solutions long-term going forward. We also have the challenge that by 2050 we will have somewhere between 2.5 and 3 billion extra people on the planet. Now, with COP21 trying to hold various emissions levels at the same level, the per capita emission that we're going to have to get to is going to be greatly reduced. As you can imagine, the population is growing. So we have quite a number of challenges going forward. So some of the competing values in innovation. We have control on the one side, and there are various constraints. Time, people, money, and then creativity, which needs to be a much more free process. And if we can quote from Professor Jeff de Graaf from the Haas School in the University of Michigan, he believes that tension between control and creativity is not only healthy, but it is in fact necessary and a source of innovation. The goal is to find a balance between exercising the control when working with constraints and not hampering creativity. So how do we do it? We have what we call the innovation funnel. So we have ideas to explore. From there we have hypotheses, and we try and validate those, and ultimately get to new offerings. And these need to be at scale. And this is always the rate-determining step. How long will it take you to get to scale? And have you the patience to get there? We have no shortage of innovative ideas coming at us. We have internal and external. And one of the things we have found about internal is that diversity of the workforce is a key contributor to innovation within the company. And then from outside, we have a constant flow of ideas coming at us. A day doesn't go by without some new idea being presented to us. And then it is for us to understand and help our own internal investors within the company understand, is this a good idea? So we begin to make decisions on which of those ideas are the most viable. And we go through the process then of culling down to a subset of ideas that fit our business and the needs of our customers. We can't look at every idea that comes at us if it's not something we're familiar enough with. Then we have the private sector dilemma. Do we innovate early, or do we wait for regulatory certainty? And we've tried both, and again, it might make for an interesting study at some point to see where success lay. For instance, new refrigerants now are on the table. We've come up with a solution for our transport refrigeration business, which halves the GWP of our refrigerant. And rather than try and have a boutique solution unique to ourselves, we've thrown it open to the industry. Because commercially, we'd rather have it available globally. Bigger market, lower price, should be an easier way to go. So we actively went ahead of legislation which we could see coming and developed a new solution and then threw it open to the industry. And now we need to partly wait for the industry to adopt it, but the other thing is we've decided from next January, next year, so a couple of weeks, that we will make it standard in our products. So we kind of get past that point. But I will say that right now, commercially, it's not an attractive solution because it costs more. New solutions tend to cost more money. But if we talk about the private sector dilemma, you know, innovating early, here's a case where we innovated early. But we believe it's the right thing to do. And so we've responded to the to the European F-gas, and the US is following, not too far behind. But early action brings risks that the markets may not be receptive to the new technologies. So we have to be cognizant of that. Another area that we chose to do, and again, it was when it wasn't. I suppose everybody wasn't doing it. Let's say we made a climate commitment in September 2014, and this was as much to set a challenge for our engineers within the company, and also to set and for our operations within the company, but also to set clearly our goals to our customers. And what we set out to do was to reduce a commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from our equipment by 50% by 2020. To invest 500 million in R&D in reducing greenhouse gas emissions over the same period. And to reduce our own operations, and as I said, we have 40,000 employees in many, many factories around the world. A 35% reduction in our own emissions within our own operations over that period. So we've, I suppose we've gone ahead of the curve. We're taking the early action, and we'll see how it plays. But we're confident that it is the right thing to do, both for our company, for our investors, and for the environment. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Darwin. And again, we will come back to questions. One thing that raises my interest is going back to the push or pull reflections. And you didn't say much of that you have done things because the government have expectations on you. On the other hand, you mentioned a number of times regulations and that you are ahead of regulations, and then we are some kind of in a discussion of sticks or carrots from the government side. Maybe we could come back to that as well. But before we do that, please, Florian, the floor is yours for the final presentation.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I'm very glad I will actually touch upon this point that Eric just mentioned, exactly the point of government regulation and the question of sticks and carrot, and as insofar they, or how actually they are supportive of new innovation, or they rather supportive of the incumbent, the existing system. So what I'll do here is I'll briefly outline the content of the issue note that I have been writing for this session together with Nick Johnston from STI at the OECD. And I'll try to run you through this as quickly as possible so we can have a lively discussion afterwards. So how to start this? There we go. So first, this is just to get a hang of the general problem or the issue we're talking about. On the left, you see green breakthrough innovation and why do we actually need this. And I think the COP21 has quite nicely illustrated, I think, the strongest dilemma here is fighting climate change while ensuring growth and prosperity. And we've also heard that yesterday from Professor Frank Geels that a world without growth, for the moment, we can't really imagine this. So the problem now is, why don't we see enough of this from the private sector? There is a certain underinvestment bias in this, and it's, I think, twofold, the reasons for this. One is because it's green technologies, and pollution isn't priced in most jurisdictions in this world. So it's this story of the negative externality. The other one is that it's actually radical and breakthrough innovation. It's things that will change the system. And so to change the system, you sort of need to know what other system you're going into. And then there's this whole story of policy uncertainty and not knowing in what environment your new innovation will actually be then. So that brings me to the right side of this slide. So what policies can actually address this underinvestment bias? And I'm going to talk about this mostly, but I think the most important thing here to notice is that the ideal or optimal policy shares these characteristics. So it's technology neutral, it's firm neutral, and you're assuming that sort of the market will pick the best winner, and actually that you not get into this pork barrel story of picking the wrong side all the time. But I will show that this might not be sufficient. So we've heard sort of three presentations now, the academic side, the small firm side, and the incumbent side on this. Just very briefly, Greg, I think, focused quite a bit on demand pull. I will try to go a bit in the technology push direction now. We've heard interesting from Marilyn on the small firms, and I think especially the financing, and as the second part of the presentation is firm dynamics, I'll try to outline some sort of ideas how to better account for this sort of dire need of financing. And I think from the incumbent perspective, what struck me most is actually the opportunity that lie out there, because we need to renew or build 75% of the infrastructure, which is huge. And this dilemma between innovating early and waiting for regulatory certainty. And in that sense, the problem that policy can often not be internationally tuned and really credible, and I think I'll touch on that a bit. So I'll go through these four things, mentioning maybe again quickly that it's sort of a very hazardous exercise. What we're trying to do, we're trying to look at discretionary support and what kind of technologies public policies should be supporting. This is the methods to do so are exploratory. So what I'll do here is I'll give an insight into different methods and different ways in supporting this public policy making, but not actually outlining exact technologies for support. Why do we actually do this? And why don't we just follow the first principle of, well, it's just technology neutral and firm neutral to support? It's for two reasons, I think. First reason is resources are limited. A government has limited resources to spend on R&D support. And I think the second one is if we really want, I think Greg also touched on this, if we really want to have these radical breakthrough innovations, we might need to select a few and really put more money in there and not just spread it across all technologies. So we might have to sort of have a restrained portfolio in order to make these breakthrough technologies really come to life. So trying to look at this a bit more deeply, discretionary support, we basically looked at two things. One is ex ante sort of studies, which is expert elicitations. So it's basically experts trying to estimate future or 2030 costs of energy. And the main insights from this is, first, and that's quite plain, but still, the R&D actually decreases future costs, though that gives a rationale for R&D support in the first place. And that R&D expenditures are much too low. Actually, they're 3 to 10 times too low across all technologies. And the portfolios should be examined more strategically, so there should be some sort of reallocation. And if you remember yesterday, for those who were here, currently the world is spending about $550 billion yearly on fossil fuel energy subsidies and $6 billion on renewable energy R&D. This mission innovation that was announced, which is a great thing, and promises, or the countries signed up to it, they promised to double their renewable energy R&D support. So just put it at scale, it's still like there's still a massive bias in this, and we have to think of how to design these support measures more strategically. The other thing we looked at is ex post, so after an invention has taken place. There we looked at patent data. So the idea is to define indicators for different technologies. I mean, for all technologies, but defining indicators and see, do certain technologies that score high on one or two indicators actually perform better later on? Performing better here is an increase in patent citations, so more sort of reference to this technology. It is commercial applicability, but it is also risk finance and traction. So what we found here, I don't know, maybe it's more or less readable. So you see the top line is the generality line. We found that the only really predictor or more or less robust positive indicator of future success is generality, which means how many sectors is a firm that patents active in. So the wider this distribution across sectors is, the more successful this technology is likely to get in the future. The good news here is that the green technology is on average more general than the counterfactual and than an average technology. So that gives sort of an incentive or a reason to support green technologies. If we further look into discretionary support, another thing that is mentioned quite often as a reason for this underinvestment bias is the fact that there are positive spillovers, and there are actually like co-fertilization or cross-fertilization processes across technologies that are difficult to capture for the single firm or for the single inventor. So what this tried to do is just try to look at the 50 top co-occurrences of technologies in patents. And you see that the light blue is 2001 to 2003, and the dark blue is 2009 to 2011. And the size of the bubble gives you the intensity of the burst. So in a sense, it gives you how much speed there was in the development of these technologies combined. So the X and Y axes are technology classes, so that's why it's mapped into this sphere, so it's always a combination of technology. You see the three red circles I put up there, they're all the environmental technologies in this sphere. So one is energy storage and distribution for electric vehicles, one is lighting, and one is batteries. And the good news about this is that all of them have dark circles around them. That means there was an increase in the burst intensity within the last 10 years. So that gives another reason to sort of go, for a public policymaker, to go more into green, because they are actually, the burst and the cross-fertilization is increasing over time. Now, moving to the second part that we looked at, moving to firm dynamics, we didn't only look at what kind of technologies are likely to emerge, but also what kind of firms are likely to bring about and to actually introduce these technologies. So on the left side, you see the distribution, the distributions of patents across different technology classes. CCMT stands for climate change mitigation technologies. So the average age of a climate change mitigation technology patenting firm is 1.5 years below the counterfactual. And that's even stronger, and you see this for the dark blue line. That's even more pronounced for patents in the electricity domain. So that means that younger firms are actually more active in green technologies. Another result that we found, which is omitted here, is that younger firms, and that's not very surprising, also invent more radical technologies. So both young firms are more in green, and they also are more into radical technologies. So, well, that's good news in a sense. Well, we have young firms, but then the bad news is that startup rates are actually declining in OECD countries at the moment. So we're actually losing these startup companies at the moment. And the other story the other side of the bad news is on the right side, and you see that environmental regulation is often biased against the incumbents. So what we did there is it's regulation on air pollution, and it measures how these regulations, or the effect of these regulations, depending on the firm age. So the bottom is the line at 1, and the line at 1 means no bias. Anything above 1 means that the regulation is stricter for new firms and more difficult to achieve for new firms, so it makes firm entry more difficult. And in a sense, this is mostly because these regulations have fixed capital requirements. There is also another side. There's the carrots, which try to sort of introduce more innovation, and they also quite often favor the incumbents. So if you look at fossil fuel subsidies, which I briefly mentioned before, that's the most obvious one. But also if you look at things like tax credits, and you think, well, who benefits from tax credits? It's usually the companies that make large profits. Usually the company that makes large profits is not the company that was invented or started 2-3 years ago, because they're not making any profit, so they don't really actually benefit from these tax credits. So it might be nice to have an idea of, okay, giving tax credits to all green firms in renewable energy might seem a very sensible policy, but might actually favor the existing sort of firm structure and not the new firms that you want. So what we really need to do is we need to investigate more closely the effect of all policy, but especially environmental policy, depending on firm age, depending on firm size, and depending on their actual R&D expenditure. So what does that mean for public policy? Well, it depends. So the thing is, this table you see here is a bit difficult to read, I understand this, but basically if you look at the column support mechanism, you see FIT, which stands for feed-in tariff, and REC, which stands for renewable energy certificates, which is just basically a price-based or a technology-based regulation. And you see that the effect of these regulations, firstly, depend on what kind of technology you want to support. Do you want to support a mature technology, or do you want to support a new sort of an immature technology? And it also depends on the financial markets, on the credit market conditions. So evaluating policy might depend both on the, let's say, the national context, which could be the financial market, and it might also depend on which technology you want to support. So this is just to say that there are probably no general conclusions as to this public policy works in all environments and for all green technologies. The second point is equally important, and I want to make here, and this is really necessary, some public support, because if you look at history and you look at some of the greatest breakthrough innovations of the 20th century, you come to the conclusion that most of them have benefited at the initial stage or even throughout a very large, sort of a long phase of demonstration from public support. So there are more examples in the issue note, but here are just a few. So finally, some conclusions. Sort of the easy ones first. It's necessary to act now because the costs are a function of cumulative emissions and not of the steady sort of flow that we emit every year. I'm just going to outline a few of these. I think the third one is very important, international cooperation. There are huge benefits promising or lying there in sort of coordinated R&D programs across countries that are better able to capture these spillovers. And for example, this announced mission innovation should also, in my opinion, this would be a sort of a good way to focus, not only to promise to scale up R&D, but to actually cooperate and actually identify fields where you invest them. We need constant evaluation. Maybe the second to last point is also important. Governments should somehow find ways to participate in successful ventures and not only bear the costs of the failed ones that they supported. Some equity participation, perhaps. The design of environmental policy, I've mentioned before. Some tougher ones, if we do increase and reallocate R&D, do we decrease it somewhere else? How do we do it? How do we define a sunset clause? That is to say, how do we define what time the government stops supporting an innovative firm? And the last point maybe is one of the toughest ones, that the finance barriers are very, very high for new firms, and lowering them would somehow require internationally coordinated policies and credible policies, and I think that's where we have to move, and COP21 probably was the first step. This discussion is a second step, and we hope we get there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Florian. The second step have a final discussion for at least 15 minutes, and I will open for the floor from the very beginning. So please raise your hands. There are microphones out there. Questions to the commanders or other reflections. We are supposed to focus on best practice, on knowledge gaps, and future work that could be foreseen, especially focusing on technologies and firm dynamics. If no questions are... Yes, we have one here, please. Name and affiliation first, please.
Yeah, I'm Antoine de Chelepret. I'm at the LSE. I have actually two questions. One is for Greg. I was wondering what he thought of, maybe defining environmental regulations together with the industry, with the idea that it would increase credibility, but perhaps at the cost of reduced ambition. And I wanted to ask Marjolaine if you had any IP with your company, and what you sort of, like Tesla's decision to put their IP in the public domain, with the idea to increase scale.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Antoine. So I guess the first thing I would say to your question is, I guess maybe just to affirm what you were implying is when we looked at the U.S. data, there's a clear trade-off between ambition and credibility. So one of the best predictors of one of those policies in the U.S. actually being achieved and meeting the target that was set was that the ambition was lower. So that kind of depends on what your social goal is. And so I think there's an interesting question about whether ambitious goals that have low credibility are productive or distracting. And I think you could make a case that they actually are productive, but you have to really make that case, I think. And then second, in terms of the collaboration between industry and developing regulations, that's an interesting way and probably an effective way to enhance credibility of the policies. If it's kind of a deliberative process where you could actually figure out what the industry really cares about, and policymakers might be able to reflect that. So I think that's really promising for establishing credibility. I think my biggest concern might be the one that was raised by Marjolaine was what happens to new entrants, and do the policy details that help bolster credibility actually deter entry, and you'd have to be really careful about that dynamic, I think.
Thanks a lot. So please, Marjolaine.
Well, we do hold 2 patents, actually. The first one was filed by the university when we were still working there. And we actually acquired it from the university. So we bought the whole patent. And, well, basically they gave it to us for a really small amount of money. Otherwise, we'd never be able to buy it from them. And, well, we decided to keep it because actually it gives us some credibility. So that's one of the main reasons for us to actually keep the patent. But what we did do was only file the patent in developed Western countries. Because what we don't want to do is, we want to build a sustainable business on all 3 aspects. So environmentally friendly, socially friendly, and economically viable in the end. So we decided not to file the patent in some of the countries that are business-wise probably very interesting. So the countries that grow rice, for example. Rice paddy fields are very interesting markets for us. But we decided not to because we think that once we've developed this technology far enough to actually make it economically viable in the Western world and in developed countries where there's a lot of electricity being used already, that we could actually bring it to the countries where electricity is much more needed and people lack electricity still, which is 20% of the world population, so that's quite a lot. We're just hoping that we can survive developing the technology in the developed world and then, well, basically donate it to the people in developing countries so that they can do it themselves. Because once it's developed, it's pretty low-tech and easy to maintain.
Thanks a lot. We have another question over there. Yes.
Freya van Duinen from the Netherlands. I have a question for Mr. Nemeth. I was very intrigued what you said about the expectations for the future. And I was thinking, did you look at the role of strategic foresight and scenario planning, how that helped to set expectations for the future and the impact of technology?
Yeah, we didn't. That work is at a pretty early stage, but that's a good one to consider. I mean, one of the ones that has struck me over the years is the Japanese government has done a really good job of creating visions of roadmaps, and I think navigating a pretty interesting trade-off between being too prescriptive and too narrow, but providing guidance. And I think that guidance of expectations has led to give confidence to firms to expand, to achieve scale. They've probably done it most impressively in electronics and semiconductors a while ago, but it's something that you could see replicated for green or for climate or energy technologies as well. So I definitely think that's an important way of enhancing credibility by creating this shared expectations. I mean, there's one argument that Moore's Law has actually been one of the most effective ways of creating Moore's Law in the future is that people believed that it was true and made investments that reflected their expectations that the prices of semiconductors would come down and the density would double every 18 months, that shared expectation was what led to confidence in expanding plants and developing new technologies and moving on to the next generation of semiconductors. So that certainly could be applicable here as well.
Thanks a lot. Yes, a short comment, and then we will take 2 more questions.
Just very briefly, maybe. We try to look exactly at this as well, at green technology foresight and sort of foresight planning, which is very promising, I think. And it's incredibly difficult to find. We found almost no really good example at a country level. So that's really something to look at in the future, I think.
We have 1 question over there and 1 question. No, sorry. There, yes, please. Please, those 2 questions, and then we will draw the line. Yes.
Hey, thank you. My name is Ashok Bilak and I come from Mauritius. I was wondering, since one of the words here is systems, we should probably have focused a little on a systems, a comprehensive, holistic approach. And one of the missing links I find is the role of banks and financing institutions, because we have the technology, and it has been a very enlightening experience listening to all the sort of experience and discoveries, etc. But access to finance, I believe, is a very determining factor. We are talking about government. Most of the projects would have to be financed by banks, because we'll be private sector, SMEs, big firms going to banks, and when they're doing the calculation, they will be using internal rate of return, payback period, and many of the projects may be turned down, especially in the light of the meltdown and credit crunch that happened in 2008. Banks have become increasingly over-prudential, and there have been a number of regulations at Basel III and other institutions that regulate banks. Most central banks are over-vigilant, and surveillance is very strong. So many of these projects, and I fear this might delay. Even when we have all the technology, the access to finance it might delay the targets for for reducing the carbon emission. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Then we take the last question over here to the right.
Thank you. My name's Ian Hughes. I'm the Irish representative on the TIP group here at OECD. When I was reading Florian's paper, the main points I was taking for that were a call for a huge increase in R&D funding, but unclear technology pathways in which for governments to invest. In hearing Greg's presentation today, it goes part the way of explaining how governments might take this risk of large-scale returns or large-scale investment with this uncertainty. But my question really is around, do we need to change how governments think about failure, or what we usually call failure? Because as you were saying, Greg, a lot of the outputs from the experiments in terms of activity, in terms of human capital, in terms of technology progress, although it may not be the big breakthrough, are actually necessary activities that feed the eventual breakthrough. So my question is, do governments need to change how they think about failure?
Thanks a lot. And before I open for each of the presenters to comment on the questions and other reflections, I would like to add one more, and it goes back probably to both the latest ones. It's the importance of knowledge and expectations. Do you have any reflections on the need for a more widespread and deeper knowledge in society at large, enabled to get the expectations and get the kind of credibility in governmental actions? Especially to Dermot, do you really care about what governments say? If we take away the regulations you have to obey. So please, Florian, some reflections on the questions or final comments.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just quickly maybe come back to the question of, do we need to rethink supporting the losers in a maybe a bit provocative way? And I think we do, because it is an essential part of the game. And I think part of really realizing this could be to design better policies that the government, if they do support these occasional breakthrough technology, that they also participate in the success, and that they can actually claim some success of the program. A part of this sort of general shift of thinking about an R&D or a support program that inherent in any of these programs is the fact that you will pick winners. What's crucial is defining what I call the sunset clause, defining the right moment and the credible strategy of when the government gets out of a venture, so that it is not captured and keeps supporting businesses that don't actually produce these radical and breakthrough innovations. I think that's the crucial point to keep in mind.
Can I add something to that? I think we don't only need to rethink the way we view failure, but success as well. What I've encountered quite often at the Dutch government, at least, and I don't know what it's like in the rest of Europe or the rest of the world, but we hear a lot, well, we don't support you, but we support the existing firms because they actually generate more jobs. The thing is, if you look at the absolute number of jobs, it's probably right. But if you look at the growth, so the percentage of growth of the small companies as compared to the existing firms, you will see a totally different playing field, actually. Because what we'll see is that some of the existing firms are actually only declining, and the only way to keep them there is by subsidizing them or by helping them stay alive, because then you maintain the jobs. The question is whether, in the end, they won't get bankrupt anyway, and whether you should maybe focus on investing that money in growing the smaller companies that actually still have a lifetime ahead of them. And I think and this is just one of the examples, and I think the way we measure both success and failure are mainly focused at existing firms and not at the new entries.
I guess your question initially was how we look to government regulation. For us, I think the regulations are fine. We need to understand, and the regulators need to understand, that they're realistic, particularly in terms of investment and timescale, so that we work together early on, I think is the message, to develop regulations. But again, I suppose, just to be a little bit provocative, as I mentioned, we're a publicly listed company. We're on the New York Stock Exchange now for 105 odd years. A bit more than that now. We have changed enormously in that time. We were a rock drilling company in 1905 when we started on the New York Stock Exchange. It's not a big business anymore. So we've done a lot of other things. So big companies can innovate too. However, I would take your point. We're one of the few from 1905 that are still on the New York Stock Exchange. So if you don't innovate and change continually, bad things happen. So it's important for all companies to continue to innovate.
Yeah, just briefly on those three questions, I'd say yes, yes, and definitely. So in terms of is access to credit an issue? Yes, for sure. Striking difference between social discount rates of maybe 2 or 3%, and as you mentioned, what companies use in the range of maybe 15%, and then looking at financing in developing countries where sometimes it's even hard to measure what discounting is used at all. So huge problem and potentially a big role for government to help with that. Second, on knowledge dissemination and availability, for sure that's an important issue as well. And one thing I would say is if we're thinking about governments becoming involved in this innovation process, one thing I found especially troubling in past government projects is that the information generated by experiments, generated by demonstrations, generated by new technologies becomes proprietary to the companies that are involved. And I don't think that is a productive use of the public money. And I don't think that information should be proprietary. For sure, there's aspects of it that can be proprietary. But if all the information is considered non-public, there's so much learning that is lost by that. And then finally, should governments be more tolerant of failures? I think that's a crucial issue, and I think it even comes down to the incentives that bureaucrats and bureaucracies are faced with, where the risk of failure is large for them on a personal level, and the payoffs to success may not be that large to them. And so there's a lot more risk aversion, and a lot less of this idea of creating a diverse portfolio with many small losers and a few big winners.
Thanks a lot. We've had very interesting presentations and very, I would say, very illustrative. The space of from the small scale, new, upcoming firm to this large scale, global, established actor, and some discussions on how we could organize thinking when we look upon technology and firm dynamics. What I bring home is a number of things, not the least the question that has been up so many times before, the role of public procurement. We could actually create the market. We could then expand the size where companies can earn money. And we could, of course, continue to develop the ways the public can buy from companies. Maybe not established products, but rather ideas and potential solutions. But what comes back here again and again is, of course, also this either a focus on incremental innovations or a focus on radical innovations, or actually both of them. And what is illustrated from you, Dermot, is of course, parallel to what we have seen in many other countries. When we try to understand the success stories of a number of transformations in Swedish industry, it was obvious that one of the success factors was that we had regulators that actually understood industry, and they could put relevant restrictions that could be coped with in the short run. And this, of course, is a very powerful way of doing incremental innovations. But it leaves out the radical ones, because those are not at all in that kind of discussion. And of course, we need both. And then back to my maybe not that precisely expressed question on knowledge and expectations. I think it's crucial that for governments to be forced to be like Ulysses, bound to the mast and be credible in that, we need much better information and much more deep knowledge spread within our societies. And we need it globally, because much of what is needed here is, of course, international cooperation, not only in finance, but also in access to new markets and new solutions. So what needs to be looked upon much more in detail in the future is, of course, one of the roles of the OECD. How can we collaborate much better on an international scale for many of these issues and operations? Please give a big hand to the presenters and thank them.